Welcome back to The Deep Dive. For nearly a decade, one show didn't just entertain us, it utterly dominated the global cultural landscape.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It brought 80s nostalgia, D&D mythology, and some genuinely compelling horror roaring back into the mainstream.
That show, of course, was Stranger Things.
And it wasn't just a hit. It was, you could argue, Netflix's defining cultural phenomenon. I mean, a global tentpole show that really set the standard for what prestige streaming content could be.
And when a series runs for that long, nearly 10 years, 5 huge seasons, millions upon millions of hours of viewership, you don't just expect an ending. You expect a unifying, triumphant finale that sticks the landing, you know, something that cements its legacy.
Instead, what we got was, well, something closer to a cultural car crash.
That's a good way to put it. The final season and its long-awaited finale generated just extreme controversy, immediate division among the fan base, and critically, according to all the data we've pulled from critics and audiences alike, it was met with truly abysmal audience ratings. So our mission today is a deep dive into this massive stack of external critical analysis commentary to understand precisely why the end of Hawkins landed not with the triumphant bang it really deserved, but with a universally criticized whimper.
And we're going beyond just a basic plot recap here. We're going to dissect the specific narrative choices that utterly polarize the audience. We'll examine the really serious accusation, corporate sense, and weaponization of legal systems that followed that initial backlash.
And we'll also have to explore the specific claims of woke propaganda that came to dominate the whole discourse. I mean, this conversation is fundamentally about the disconnect between creators, corporate mandates, and what the audience expects.
Exactly.
So let's unpack the initial data shock because it really sets the stage for just how severe this reaction. We are talking about The Brit. Now, this was the episode many people saw as the penultimate emotional setup before the final. It hit a staggeringly low audience rating of 5.4 or 5.5 out of...
Think about that. This is a show that even in its, let's say, weaker early season, it never dipped below an 8.0.
Never.
So for the episode that's supposed to be setting up the grand conclusion of a global phenomenon to be rated 5.4 out of 10, I mean, that's barely a passing grade, it instantly became the lowest rated episode of the entire series run.
Wow.
That's not a small complaint. That is a foundational crisis of faith from the audience.
And that low score didn't exist in a vacuum, right? It dragged the overall Rotten Tomatoes audience score for the final season sharply downward to just 56%.
56%. For a prestige IP that was once considered the absolute height of pop culture, a 56% audience score signals a severe, profound, and, undeniable disconnect between what the creators delivered and what their dedicated viewers actually wanted.
So what specific moment triggered this meltdown? We have to start with the core issue that critics claimed absolutely ruined the pacing in the show.
Well, that brings us directly to episode 7, and specifically to the highly criticized coming out scene featuring the character Will Byers.
Right.
The commentary we've seen notes that the production team treated this moment with just an enormous amount of gravity, which suggests they knew its significance, but maybe miscalculated the execution.
That gravity is so clearly demonstrated in the production notes. We have sources indicating that the Duffer Brothers reportedly spent the longest amount of time writing this specific scene compared to literally any other moment in the entire 5-season run.
And then it required a massive 12 hours of filming time to capture the moment they wanted.
12 hours.
12 hours. That just underscores how important this emotional beat was to the show's creative direction. They put all their chips on this one moment.
And the content itself was, on the surface, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Will declares his identity, and it's followed almost immediately by acceptance, a group hug from the cast, and a declaration from his mother that she would never leave.
It was designed to be a moment of pure emotional affirmation. The actor, Noah Schnapp, was reportedly in tears during filming, feeling the moment was perfect. He even admitted later that playing the role helped him come out in real life, which is a genuine human story stemming from the art.
Absolutely. It's a genuine human story of an artist finding clarity through his work, and that should have been a beautiful thing. But this emotional, real-world context was almost immediately weaponized by critics who focused entirely on the execution and the timing within the fictional narrative.
The criticism was really two-pronged, aimed squarely at both the narrative timing and the execution itself.
Critics just slammed the scene's insertion as being cringy, ham-fisted, and utterly ill-timed.
One source we found highlighted the jarring tonal whiplash. It pointed out the narrative stakes surrounding them. They described the moment as pausing a worlds colliding humanity on the brink of non-existence scenario. The final battle against Vecna, the opening of the Upside Down, just for a very long and melodramatic coming out story.
And this is the crux pacing. You have the literal apocalypse opening up, the biggest, most existential threat the world has ever faced, and yet the main characters stop everything for what amounted to, a 10-minute group therapy session and a deep character monologue.
Exactly. The argument was that this personal character moment completely destroyed the pacing and the momentum the episode had been building toward the finale. It was like hitting the emergency brake on a speeding train.
And the criticism went significantly deeper than just pace. It focused on the specific narrative utility provided, which some commentators labeled as the power of gay.
Right, and this is the argument was that the entire plot device was built around the idea that Will needed to accept his sexuality for his power, specifically his connection to the hive mind, to be fully unleashed.
So the only way to defeat the villain, therefore, Will's self.
That's the critique, that this framed being gay as the greatest superpower, transforming the central multi-season conflict into a story about, as some put it, pushing this narrative on children through an overly simplistic and functional narrative mechanism.
It felt transactional, not organic.
Precisely. It created this incredibly uncomfortable juxtaposition where Will's internal struggle, which should have been deeply personal and resonant, was explicitly tied to saving the world. It felt less like a natural character development and more like a forced narrative mandate designed to justify the message, regardless of the narrative cost.
Let's just pause on the real-world consequence of the actor's experience for a moment. The source material notes Noah Schnapp's credit to the role for helping him come out. But as you mentioned, this was immediately twisted by a segment of critics.
It was. They used it to argue that the actor was essentially groomed by Hollywood to become homosexual.
Which is an incredibly toxic interpretation, suggesting malice where the actor himself found.
It really speaks to the level of toxicity and polarization this single character arc generated. I mean, when a scene written with such emotional earnestness is interpreted by a vocal segment of the audience as calculated grooming and propaganda, the show has completely lost control of its narrative intent.
And more profoundly, this scene became what critics called an identity shield for the show.
Yeah, let's unpack that. The identity shield, it's a huge insight. What does it mean when a scene becomes an identity?
Well, an identity shield is a narrative defense mechanism. It means that the show's creators strategically insert a marginalized theme or character arc in such a way that the audience cannot criticize the execution, the pacing, the writing, the timing, the structure of the story without first having to defend their own moral.
So it deflects structural critique by instantly classifying it as bigotry.
Exactly. So if I say the scene was poorly paced and it ruined the buildup to the Vecna fight, the automatic rebuttal from some sections of the community is you're just homophobic and hate gay characters.
And that's the core function of the identity shield. It protects the content from legitimate structural critique. And the irony, as multiple sources pointed out, was that this scene was so poorly executed, so ham-fisted, that even members of the LGBTQ plus community publicly expressed dislike.
Right.
They were arguing it was just terrible writing that didn't do justice to the concept. It failed to resonate across the board because its timing and functional execution served the political agenda or the mandate more than the character's reality or the plot momentum.
So the intense, immediate, and structurally deep criticism of Episode 7, the lowest-rated episode ever, it didn't end there, did it?
No, not at all. It triggered a fascinating and frankly disturbing reaction from the studio. Creators of critique videos suddenly claimed that Netflix reacted to the negative feedback with a corporate counterattack, censorship, and the deliberate weaponization of copyright.
This was a genuine surprise to many in the YouTube content creator community.
Oh, a huge surprise. Historically, Netflix has been cited as one of the better studios regarding fair use and copyright enforcement, especially when you compare them to older traditional media. But specifically around the release of this finale, Netflix suddenly became really aggressive with copyright striking and claiming videos that criticized Will's scene and the finale's quality.
So let's go deep into the practical impact of these copyright claims on YouTubers and online personalities, because for the listener, this isn't just some legal fight, it's a career threat. What does weaponization of copyright look like in practice for a...
Well, the punishment is the process itself. It's that simple. If a creator uploads a 20-minute video criticizing the show, and they use, say, 30 seconds of footage under standard fair use for commentary.
Right, which should be perfect.
Should be. But Netflix can immediately place a copyright claim.
And what happens then?
An immediate financial catastrophe. A copyright strike or claim immediately kills a video's trajectory and its reach. It just tanks it, leading to potentially millions of lost views because the YouTube algorithm throttles content that's under dispute.
And more critically,
the video immediately becomes ineligible for monetization, the AdSense revenue, even if the creator used only a short snippet of copyrighted content. This means hours of detailed work suddenly generates zero income.
So Netflix doesn't necessarily have to win the legal battle. They just need to issue the claim to cause severe financial harm to the critic.
Exactly. They understand that a small to mid-sized YouTuber cannot afford to enter a prolonged legal dispute or even a lengthy counter-notification process with a massive corporation like Netflix. The punishment is the financial cost and time sink of fighting the claim, even if the critique is legally protected as fair use.
So the accusation, therefore, is that studios deliberately weaponize YouTube's copyright system to shut down criticism.
That's the claim. It's an effective mechanism because YouTubers, fearing complete channel strike, demonetization, or just loss of their livelihood, are forced to self-censor or risk their entire business model. The fear isn't just about protecting IP, it's about curbing dissent in controlling the narrative.
That's just stunning corporate. Prioritizing narrative control over freedom of commentary. It speaks volumes about the priorities, which I guess leads us to the counter-argument that was immediately deployed by proponents to explain away the backlash.
Right. To counter the rising tide of structural and narrative criticism, fans and some commentators immediately pushed the powerful counter-argument that the backlash, the review bombing, and all the anger was less about poor writing or pacing, and mostly because of homophobia.
The logic there seems, if you accepted the show for years, why stop now?
Precise. They argued that the show had featured straight romances, Mike and Eleven, the whole Nancy, Jonathan, and Steve love triangle, Dustin and Susie for hours over the course of the series, without any complaint, controversy, or review.
But the moment the show included a few minutes of a gay story, specifically Will's scene,
an angry mob showed up screaming about agenda. Therefore, the audience criticizing the scene must be doing so from a place of bigotry, because the rejection couldn't possibly be about the quality of the writing.
And this is where the media critique of the show's defense becomes vital. If we connect this to the broader picture, this tactic of labeling critic is pervasive across modern entertainment, isn't it?
It is, and what's fascinating here is how effectively this framing shifts the discussion entirely. Once a segment of the audience expresses profound dislike or disappointment with content, critics, and often the showrunners themselves, rather than engaging with the structural critique, they just label the dissenting audience as racist, fascist, or homophobic.
And that serves as the ultimate defense mechanism against disappointment.
It transforms a narrative critique into a moral failing, thus shielding the show from legitimate structural feedback. Essentially, if you don't like the content, you are morally compromised.
Which allows studios to ignore genuine audience notes entirely, proceed with their intended thematic messaging, and then classify any resulting failure, whether it's low ratings or financial underperformance, as an inevitable clash with an unwoke or bigoted audience.
Rather than acknowledging flaws in execution, pacing, or story structure, it creates an almost infallible defense, because who wants to argue with the accusation of bigotry?
So if the Will Byers controversy and the subsequent censorship claims set off the first alarm, the final 2-hour episode itself, The Right Side Up, was the 4-alarm fire that structurally collapsed the show's narrative integrity. Let's talk about the pacing, because critics universally describe this episode as bloated, overwritten, and having an abysmal failure of structural pacing.
The structural mandate of the finale was its undoing. The main climactic battle, the true resolution to the massive interdimensional conflict involving Vecna and the Godzilla-sized Mind Flayer, concluded roughly 1 hour into the 2-hour episode.
Wait, that is an astonishing choice. So the moment of existential dread, the threat to all humanity, the thing we spent 4 seasons building toward, it ends exactly halfway through the final installment.
It did, which left the entire second hour for an extended, sentimentally overblown epilogue. The remaining 60 minutes were spent on characters saying goodbye, giving speeches, wrapping up personal arcs, and delivering thematic lectures.
So the critique is that once Vecna was defeated, the narrative stakes just evaporate instantly.
Completely.
Yeah.
We shifted from existential dread to high school drama in a massive narrative deceleration, causing an intense, irrecoverable whiplash.
And let's analyze the disappointment of the final battle. The setup was a kaiju-level threat, a true interdimensional war. Yet the resolution was described as deeply anticlimactic.
The sources we looked at repeatedly noted the extreme simplicity of the final conflict. The massive Mind Flayer and Vecna were ultimately defeated easily by a bunch of kids wielding Molotov cocktails, spears, a simple shotgun, and an axe. One source compared the confrontation not to an epic fantasy showdown, but to a basic, simplistic D&D campaign. Go to the castle, kill the bad guys.
Yeah.
No intricate strategy, no meaningful sacrifice, just a straightforward assault.
Okay, I have to stop you there. Vecna, the ultimate psychic overlord who shrugs off bullets, is defeated by a medieval spike and an axe. Is that not just a stunning failure of writing and internal consistency, regardless of who wields the axe?
It is. According to the sources, the critique of inconsistent power scaling was immediate and severe. Vecna was previously portrayed as this untouchable psychic entity that could not be stopped by physical force or even heavy weaponry.
Right.
So for him to die after being pushed onto a spike or a tooth, followed by Joyce chopping off his head with an axe, felt far too simple for a villain with 4 seasons of complex, terrifying buildup.
And while critics conceded that Joyce getting the kill moment was surprisingly satisfying for her character arc,
the means of Vecna's defeat was completely anticlimactic. They prioritized a crowd-pleasing action beat over the show's own established internal logic.
and the structural laziness just extended into massive, ignored plot. Where did all the lower-tier upside-down mon go? The demogorgons, demodogs, democrats.
The sources were baffled. We spent seasons fearing these hordes. Yet, in the final biggest conflict, they simply disappeared from the Upside Down without explanation.
The critique is simple, then. The narrative found them no longer convenient, so they were just magic.
Exactly, leaving only Vecna and the Mind Flayer for the heroes.
And then there's the military subplot, which I found baffling even in the summer. The kids were explicitly responsible for subverting highly classified military operations, sabotaging vital missions, destroying government equipment.
And even causing the deaths of dozens of active duty personnel during the fight for Hawkins.
Right. Yet, 18 months later in the epilogue, the military seems to have just forgotten the entire classified operation, allowing the characters to walk free, go to college, happily ever after.
That decision speaks volumes about the central problem, a safety mandate. It was a complete refusal to impose any real-world consequences on the heroes.
And this unwillingness to take risks ties directly into the critique of character.
It does. The cast became insanely bloated. The writers, instead of focusing on the core group, were forced to create these convoluted subplots just to ensure every single character had something to do in the 2-hour finale.
And the ultimate failure in this regard was the lack of meaningful main character death. This show had established a dark, consequential pattern. You had Barb in Season 1, Bob in Season 2, Eddie in Season 4, beloved characters were killed, which gave the threat real teeth stakes. But in the final, biggest threat, every single main character survived with ironclad plot armor, leaving the finale feeling utterly stakeless.
If the audience knows that the central cast cannot die, then the threat is inherently neutralized. And speaking of neutralization, we have to address the inconsistency of Will Byers' powers in the final battle. It just further illustrates the lazy on-demand writing.
This inconsistency was particularly jarring.
Well, the writers had established that Will, having broken the psychic link, was still physically affected by Vecna's pain, meaning using the connection was a massive, physically costly risk.
Okay, so there were stakes to using his power.
There was supposed to be. Yet moments later, he is shown ripping off Vecna's arm using the hive mind connection, apparently completely unaffected by the retaliatory damage he should have suffered.
So the emotional and physical consequences of his power, which were established minutes earlier, were just conveniently ignored.
Ignored to facilitate a cool but narratively cheap action beat. It's a hallmark of writing that prioritizes temporary excitement over long-term consistency.
So if the first hour of the finale was ruined by catastrophic pacing issues and structural flaws, the second extended epilogue was ruined, according to the sources we analyzed, by the heavy-handed insertion of overt woke elements and political. And the central complaint here is that these elements felt deeply anachronistic for the set. 1980s conservative Indiana.
This is where the core of the political and ideological backlash really lies. The show transitioned abruptly from wrapping up the monster arcs to delivering post-battle thematic lectures that sounded completely disconnected from the 1986 setting.
And to understand the critique, you have to contextualize the setting, right?
You do. 1980s Indiana. This is the heart of the Reagan era. It was a highly conservative red state characterized by Cold War paranoia, intense patriotism, and deep societal discomfort with the very concepts of difference and political dissent that the show suddenly started championing.
Exactly. So when Dustin stands up to give his high school graduation, the expectation is a speech about shared victory, coming of age, maybe remembering the fallen.
Instead, he takes the stage, and his speech is interpreted by critics as a clear corporate-style lecture. He lectures his classmates about diversity and inclusivity.
He literally tells his high school class that meeting different people made us stronger and a better person, using the language of contemporary corporate sensitivity training, not 1980s high school rhetoric.
And that corporate lecture tone felt painfully, specifically out of place. Critics immediately interpreted this as a clear, unsubtle reference to Will's sexuality, a post hoc justification for the inclusion of the earlier content.
And then the messaging goes further and harder into political terror. Dustin rips off his graduation gown and shouts, "Screw the system!"
Which critics interpreted as a pure, anachronistic communist or anarcho-socialist rant completely divorced from the setting.
In 1980s Indiana, shouting "screw the system" at a high school graduate, especially amidst intense anti-Soviet sentiment and Cold War, would be met not with applause and triumph, but with genuine hostility and problem.
Of course, but the show treated it as a moment of youthful rebellion when it was historically and culturally tone deaf. It suggested the characters sound less like 1980s teenagers and more like 2025 progressives cosplaying in period costumes.
And this anachronistic messaging wasn't limited to Duff.
Not at all. Jonathan also contributes to this with an insertion of an anti-capitalist monologue that felt entirely unearned and out of character, focusing on the meaninglessness of suburban life under capitalism. The common thread is that the writing completely failed to capture the genuine dialogue and political context of the period.
They just substituted it with contemporary talking points.
Exactly.
And the handling of the Nancy Steve Jonathan love triangle was equally criticized for inserting simplistic modern messaging that betrayed seasons of emotional development.
The love triangle was a major emotional arc. And how did the show resolve it? Nancy ditches both Steve and Jonathan, not to pursue a complex intellectual path or for college, but explicitly to pursue a meaningless corporate job, a vague, unsatisfying career choice.
Meanwhile, Steve and Jonathan, who had been romantic rivals for years, suddenly bond in the epilogue, declaring Nancy an independent woman who don't need no man.
The show completely discarded the deep emotional investment built over 4 seasons in favor of resolving this complex triangle with a simplistic, third-wave feminist message. It felt bizarre, unsatisfying, and bizarrely clean.
It treated the relationships as something to be tidily discarded for a thematic message, rather than resolved organically through character choice.
Precise.
And what about the crucial follow-up to the Will Byers coming out scene? I mean, if the coming out was the setup, this epilogue moment was supposed to be the emotional payoff and resolution.
It was heavily criticized for being incredibly cringy and forced. Mike spends the scene almost in tears, what critics described as flagellating himself for his past stupidity, saying he wished he would have seen Will's gayness sooner. The emotional arc was centered on Mike's self-guilt rather than Will's journey of acceptance.
And the scene culminates in that highly criticized exchange of best friends.
Critics universally felt that this was just simplistic, writing dialogue suitable for 12-year-olds in a Disney Channel special, not young adults who had just survived an interdimensional apocalypse and were at the cusp of high school graduation.
It made the entire crucial resolution feel incredibly unnatural and juvenile.
It failed to pay off the emotional weight the show had attempted to place on Will's character arc.
And finally, we have to discuss Eleven's fate, or the conspicuous lack thereof. She attempts a forced suicide sacrifice to destroy the Upside Down, seemingly to avoid military experimentation and the creation of more.
And this felt completely empty, hollow, and stupid to many viewers because it was so contradictory to her established character.
She's a fighter.
Exactly. Eleven is established as a quintessential fighter, a resilient protagonist whose entire journey has been about taking control of her power and fighting back against her abusers. For her to suddenly give up, stating she couldn't fight the military after defeating the Mind Flayer and Vecna, made no narrative sense.
It lacked the genuine emotional purpose of her Season 1 sacrifice, which was an act of raw power and protection.
And of course, the Duffer Brothers couldn't even commit to that death. The finale immediately ends with Mike suggesting that Eleven faked her death and is still out there, leaving the door open for her inevitable return.
It just reinforced the critique that the creators prioritize narrative safety and commercial continuation over meaningful consequence.
They wanted the dramatic impact of a sacrifice without the permanent loss of a major marketable character, resulting in a hollow gesture that satisfied neither the emotional arc nor the plot requirement.
So we have a finale defined by catastrophic pacing, contradictory character arcs, heavy-handed political messaging, and a severe refusal to impose. The general consensus, pulled from our sources, is that Stranger Things profoundly failed to stick the landing.
It left its otherwise phenomenal legacy tarnished and even compared unfavorably to the conclusion of Game of Thrones.
The comparison to Game of Thrones is interesting, but critics drew a distinction in motivation, didn't they?
They did. In Gati, the showrunners were reportedly desperate to end the show quickly because they were bored and wanted to move on. The Duffer Brothers, conversely, seemed intent on drawing everything out, playing it as safe as possible, and tying everything up with the safest, neatest, if most unsatisfying bow.
And since the official ending was such a letdown, fans and prominent commentators immediately went to work, suggesting detailed, highly structured alternatives that they felt would have truly honored the show's legacy and mythological buildup.
Which just proves how much the audience cared.
It does. Let's start with the redemption arc suggested by creator Jack Pobiak.
Right. Jack Pobiak, a prominent cultural commentator, suggested a narrative fix centered on giving Vecna or Henry Creel a Darth Vader moment, a moment of profound self-sacrifice and redemption.
How would that work?
In this scenario, Henry throws himself off the dark influence of the Mind Flayer, realizes the horror of what he has become, and joins Eleven and the team in the final moment.
So he assists in banishing Vecna and destroying the Upside Down from the inside?
Exactly. This provides the complex emotional redemption story that critics felt was completely lacking in the simplistic Spike and Axe end. The ultimate villain gets a moment of heroic complexity.
And the consequences of this action would have been far more profound and emotionally devastating.
Way more profound. Instead of simply closing the gate, their combined power accidentally opens a rift, not back into the Upside Down, but into a momentary overworld. And through this rift, they briefly see all the innocent, killed characters. Barb, Bob, Eddie, even Henry's own family, who were victims of the Upside Down.
That's a powerful visual concept. It gives the sacrifice real meaning.
Absolutely. The main cast then returns to the normal world with a profound sense of loss and trauma. But their final mission isn't to graduate high school. Their mission becomes protecting this new, mysterious overworld rift from ever reopening.
Which provides a clear, high-stakes, and emotionally loaded final mission that connects the losses of the past of the character. I like that.
It honors the entire journey.
Now, the second major fan-suggested fix involves a creative pivot to the show's underlying mythology, shifting the focus to a more overt demonic perspective.
This is where the D&D analogy gets serious. This scenario suggests framing the Upside Down, not merely as a parallel dimension with D&D monsters, but as a genuine overt hellmouth.
And its monsters as overtly demonic or theological.
Right. This would have strengthened the narrative foundation for a multi-season arc rooted in classic horror convention. The demons would actively corrupt people on Earth, perhaps using psychic connections like Will, using nascent powers to destabilize humanity.
And this would naturally force the heroes, the Scooby-Doo kids, to team up with a completely different kind of
an exorcist, a theologian, or a figure rooted in religious horror. It adds an entirely new dimension of threat and resolution, moving beyond simple science fiction power scaling. It gives the conflict a much stronger, more meaningful foundation, rooted in classic horror and theological concepts, rather than just vague sci-fi mystery boxes and psychic battles.
And while the creative legacy of the original show is now being passionately debated and rewritten by fans, the commercial strategy employed by Netflix during the finale's release reveals just how much money was truly at stake.
And how far corporations will go to protect their bottom line.
The finale had a successful theatrical run over New York, clearing over $25 million session cap. That's a massive, profitable event. But here's where the corporate cunning comes, and this is truly shocking. The sources report that to avoid paying the cast and creators residuals based on contractual terms tied to ticket sales, Netflix did not charge.
So how do they make money?
Instead, they reserved seats using concession vouchers, thus classifying the profit entirely as food and beverage.
No way. It's an explicit, calculated strategy. Residuals are based on gross theatrical box office revenue. By classifying $25 million in revenue as concession sales, they were effectively sidestepping the contractual obligations for residuals owed to the cast and creators.
It's a stunning example of financial engineering, prioritizing revenue over satisfying talent contracts.
And that one action, a manipulation of revenue classification to avoid paying talent, provides a tangible, real-world example of the corporate mandates that critics claim compromised the narrative integrity of the show in the first.
It reinforces the idea that financial safety was the top priority.
And finally, the Duffer Brothers are already looking to the future, making sure this IP continues its life. They have confirmed that a spin-off is coming, one that, crucially, doesn't involve any of the characters in Hawkins, The Upside Down, or the 1980s.
So they are completely jettisoning the highly contentious Sting narrative and cast. This new series will build its own mythology around a specific plot device, Magic Walk.
This is a fragment of the Mind Flayer found in Season 5. The source material notes that this object was the catalyst, the thing responsible for corrupting Henry Creel and setting him on his villainous path. This small fragment will be the new foundation for the entire mythology moving.
The move suggests they are intentionally creating a new sandbox, separate from the contentious and critically challenged Hawkins crew.
Potentially setting up connections to broader tinfoil hat conspiracy UFO lore, like Montauk and Roswell, returning to the show's early influence, but with a fresh cast and time.
They're also planning an animated show, Stranger Things 85, Tales 5.
Which suggests that if the new Magic Rock mythology fails to connect with audiences, they can always retreat to the show's universally beloved best era via cartoon format. The franchise survival plan is clearly complex and multi-layered.
So if we summarize the deep dive, the tension of the Stranger Things finale truly boiled down to a battle between corporate mandate, political mess, and narrative integrity.
And the result was an ending that was the safest, most simplistic, and least consequential conclusion possible, leaving its massive, dedicated audience deeply dissatisfied after such complex, long-running build.
The finale revealed a profound discomfort with narrative consequence, prioritizing political sermons and emotional safety nets over stakes and strong, organic storytelling.
But beyond the structural and narrative failings, the aftermath revealed something even more important and, you could say, insidious about the relationship between modern studios and their audiences.
And that is?
The episode showed us that studios, specifically Netflix in this case, aren't just protecting their brand or intellectual property. They are actively and aggressively weaponizing the copyright system, a legal tool, as a mechanism to curb and silence legitimate criticism and public disappointment.
They are punishing you for not liking their content.
And this raises a serious, provocative question for you, the viewer, moving forward. What does the weaponization of censorship against audience disappointment signal about the entertainment industry's relationship with you? If studios refuse to accept structural critique and use legal means to financially harm those who voice disappointment, are modern mass-market content creators still interested in genuine artistic engagement? Or are they simply creating vehicles to deliver a specific message while silencing anyone who pushes back? That's something to mull over until our next